So now let's dive into the impulse device, and we can see that we've got up to 8 different sample slots that we can drag and drop in here. I can click and hot swap any one of these samples. If you go to the drums folder up top in the browser, then you can go and find a different drum sound, open the folder, it says drum hits, and let's grab, say instead of the tambourine sound, maybe I want to drop in something like a ride cymbal into this slot. So I can click and drag it directly into the impulse device, or I could click hot swap and just double click on that sample, it'll go away. Here on the far right, these are the global controls. We have volume, time, and transpose. They all deal with all the samples all together. So those are your global controls. And then, as we looked at before, we have all these individual controls, which is specific to the highlighted sample. So let's start with the hi-hat. I have this clip already going. The start over here has to do with the initial attack of the sample. So as you turn that up, you'll notice the initial hit actually fades in. It's almost kind of like a volume control, but it's messing with what's called the envelope. So let's listen. You can hear the hi-hat kind of fades out a little bit, and it takes out that initial, what we call transient. We also have the transpose, which adjusts the pitch of the sample. And 12 semitones equals 1 octave. And below that, we have the velocity. So the velocity and the transpose amount can be directly connected to each other. So as the sample is being played back, the velocity, you can turn up the velocity and then mess with the transpose button, and it's going to actually happen based on the velocity. So for example, if I set at 80%, versus, it makes a very subtle difference in the way the pitch is being modulated. So the random button below that will transpose at different intervals. We also have stretch. And stretch is basically how sustained the sound is going to be. So if you pull down stretch, you're going to notice it a lot more when you have the drive on. So you could turn the drive on or off. And this little button SAT stands for saturation, which is just a fancy word for distortion. So you can really drive things and make it sound really distorted, almost like a guitar amp. Just makes it kind of sound thicker. We also have a frequency knob. We've got different kinds of filters. And filters are great for basically what we would call EQing, or cutting out any frequencies we don't want. So for example, I might put a high pass filter at 30 hertz for kick drums, because it takes out super low subs of a bass, and it actually makes a kick sound a little punchier and tighter when you have bass instruments playing with it. Same thing with hi-hats. If you have a high pass filter, you can roll off some of the mid range into the low range of a hi-hat that you might not necessarily want to. And we'll talk more about that in other courses for mixing, but just so you know, this is a really good thing to use for shaping and sculpting sounds for mixing as well as sound design. So then we also have the decay, and the decay is dealing with the envelope, which I mentioned earlier. So you can make it sound a lot tighter. You have 2 modes down here called trigger or gate. So gate bypasses the decay. If you have it in trigger mode, then you can actually make it sound a little tighter and choppier. We also have pan, so we can pan the sample to the left or right, which is really great for drums. It's weird to have all the drums down the center of the mix, so typically I'll pan the hi-hat like a little bit to the left or the right, snare drum a little left or right, always leaving the kick drum down the middle. But panning is great for creating depth in a song. So over here we have the volume. We have our solo button, our mute for each individual sample. You can play with those. You can also do that up here by selecting either one of those buttons. Another fun tip to know is on the very last slot in the impulse, where you drop a sample over here, you'll notice that there's something in the bottom left corner. and it's called link. And link basically locks in the far to right sample slots. We can make these two samples interact with each other, and it links them. So when one sample is played, if another sample is also triggered at the same time or right after each other, one is going to cut the other one off. The best way to demonstrate this is with hi-hats. So for example, when a drummer's playing, a hi-hat will open and close, which is what you would call choking. And we'll talk about that feature in the drum rack too. This is just one example of using this, but it can be really fun to have different samples interacting with each other. But let's go ahead and, for this sample, have the hi-hat open and close itself. So now what happens when this open hi-hat happens, normally you'd hear that sample continue to play out, but once the close hi-hat sound happens, because they're linked, it's going to cause the close hi-hat to cut off the open hi-hat. So it'll be like, psst, and you'll hear it. And let's listen to what it sounds like. It's cool to use for other samples, so not just for a hi-hat. So get really creative with that. You can have really long samples that ring out, just chop each other off. It's kind of tight. Hope you learned a couple things with the Impulse. This is a good intro to just making beats in Ableton. You can do a lot of cool sounds in here. You can make your own custom Impulse or play with the different presets that are in the browser.